So today's lecture continues the discussion of absolutism in Europe by looking at a couple other examples of absolute powers during this time period. And it also looks at an important historical event that kind of helps to give rise to some of these absolute powers and explains or demonstrates really the strong power some of these monarchs came to have. We're going to start with that historical event, which is the 30 Years' War. It gets its name because it was 30 years, from 1618 to 1648. And it really is a religious war. It pits Catholics against Protestants. Again, this is a couple decades after the Protestant Reformation begins, and the war breaks out in a region called Bohemia in the city of Prague, which today is in the Czech Republic. And so it actually starts with kind of a ridiculous story. There was the emperor of the king Ferdinand of Prague. He was Catholic, and he was trying to only allow Catholicism to be practiced in the region. And so some Protestant nobles who were angry at this actually threw out two Catholic aides or ministers to Ferdinand out the window of the castle in Prague. And so that is known as the defenestration of Prague. Defenestration is just a fancy word for throwing someone out the window. And so this conflict eventually there was a lot of tension behind this, obviously, and so this is almost like the straw that breaks the camel's back, and it leads to warfare. But what should be, ultimately should be a local, regional war becomes almost a continent-wide war because of the religious overtones of it. There's just two pictures of the castle at Prague, in Prague. It's a massive complex, pretty high up. The two people got thrown out the window actually did not die, so it was not too tragic, but it did end up leading to a massive war and conflict. So again, this is the region shaded in darker green here. That is Bohemia, and it's part of the larger Holy Roman Empire, which at the time was controlled by Ferdinand, who was a Catholic. The war breaks out, and then eventually the Swedes and the Danes, so the King of Denmark and the King of Sweden, decide to get involved in the war. And Denmark and Sweden are to the north of the Holy Roman Empire. So this is Denmark here and Sweden over here. The war breaks out, but these two other powers decide to get involved. Why? Because the Swedes and Danes are Protestants, and they have something to gain by weakening the Catholic power of the Holy Roman Empire. And so they get involved on the behalf of Protestants to help weaken their rival, which is the Holy Roman Empire. France also becomes involved. And if you know anything about France, you know that the monarch, from the previous lecture, the monarch is Catholic, and the majority of French people are Catholic, even to this day. So logically, you would think France would ally itself with the Holy Roman Empire if it's purely a religious war. But in reality, there are other factors, and France actually becomes allied with the Holy Roman Empire's enemies, with Ferdinand's enemies. The reason for this is because France, and the King of France, wants to kind of exert his power and his influence, and again, the Holy Roman Empire is his biggest rival, and in particular his biggest Catholic rival. And so to kind of limit their power, they go to war against them as well. So while it is a religiously inspired war, it's not a neat, clean-cut picture there. The war lasts 30 years. It's one of the most brutal wars in Europe, really up until the modern wars, modern world wars, and the wars of Napoleon in the 1800s. By the end of the war, it really essentially almost ends in a draw, a tie. The result, the Peace of Westphalia, is what named after the town that the peace treaty was signed, essentially ends the religious conflict that had been happening in Europe since the Reformation. Protestant princes are allowed to kind of be Protestant, Catholics are Catholic. It kind of ends the intense religious warfare of the time period. And so this map here kind of shows what the world looks like, what Europe looks like at the end. You have the pink shaded areas are controlled by the Austrian Habsburgs, who are Catholic. The Spanish Habsburgs, the yellow, who are also Catholic, they're from the same branch of family. But in the north here, in the orange, you see shades of Prussia. And Prussia is going to emerge as a powerful absolute monarchy in the following years and decades. And so the first question on your lecture activity is really this question: What was the main cause of the 30 years? Was the main cause of the 30 Years' War religious or political? I want you to kind of defend it with some examples or evidence from this lecture video here. So that will be the first question on your lecture activity. All right, and so here we have outlined here is the Austrian Empire at the time, the Holy Roman Empire, which kind of eventually becomes the Austrian Empire. And it's shaded, outlined there in red. And so we're going to focus this. The next part of this conversation is focusing on them because they're one of the other absolute powers that we have to discuss in this unit. Austria-Hungary, or Austria as it's known as at the time, is unique kind of among the other absolute powers because they're very ethnically diverse. Right? A lot of different ethnic groups that speak different languages, have different customs, and some different religions. Are all part of this one larger empire. So the path to absolutism is a little trickier for Austria than it would be for places like England, say, or France. So within Austria, you have Germans, people who are Czech, Austrians, Hungarians, Polish, Slovaks, Slavic peoples in general, which are Eastern Europeans, Croats, people from Croatia, and even some Italians. So very ethnically diverse. And eventually, a woman named Maria Theresa comes to power around the year 1740. She inherits the throne. She was the only heir, right? And there's anger throughout Europe and other parts of Europe that, and even within her own empire, that a female ruler was ruling, right? That it wasn't a male. And so this leads to the War of Austrian Succession, right? Succession means who gets to succeed, follow up after someone dies, who gets to take their place. That's what inspires this conflict, this War of Austrian Succession. And of course, other empires and other kingdoms are always trying to get more power, more influence, and so they go to war. And one of those people are the Prussians. Prussians were becoming a major force at this time, but Maria Theresa is able to kind of hold off and prevent the Prussians from fully taking over. She does lose a territory called Silesia, which is in modern day Poland. It's kind of pointed out in this map here. She loses control of that, but overall manages to keep her empire together, which is important. And she manages to exert great power over her country. One way she manages to kind of become more popular and thus gain more power is reforming the tax system, where she eases the burden of taxes on the peasants. The peasants paid the overwhelming amount of the taxes, and nobles really didn't pay much, and she kind of eases that and forces the nobility to pay more. Right, so again, limiting and weakening the nobility. We see that seems to be a common theme here in absolute monarchies, and kind of appealing more directly to the masses, right? So you get other groups to side with you over the local lords as a way to weaken the lords and strengthen the monarchy. Another empire that we need to talk about, another kingdom, I should say, is Prussia, which kind of forms out of a small German state in 1714, around the early 18th century. Originally, it was part of the Holy Roman Empire. It was a small principality or a small kingdom that eventually grows more and more powerful. And by 1714, this is the territory they control there in green. The Prussian monarchs are a family known as the Hohenzollern family, and they were a member of the Prussian nobility that comes to rise above the Prussian nobility. And so what they do to kind of strengthen their power is that they actually take the Prussian nobles, they're known as Junkers, and they take these Junkers and they actually incorporate them into the military. They make them the generals and the leading people of their military. And by doing that, it's kind of a different approach, right? The nobility still plays a role here in gaining absolute power, but instead of kind of disenfranchising them and weakening them, the Prussians incorporate them into their system, right? And force them essentially to become loyal to the crown by making them military generals and leaders. The Prussians become very well known for being a strong military, and they managed to expand pretty rapidly during the 18th century, the 1700s. They also helped themselves become very absolute and strong by creating a very strong bureaucracy. And what a bureaucracy is it's the government that essentially keeps it's what keeps the government functioning, right? So all the different departments, one bureaucracy, part of the bureaucracy might be in charge of collecting taxes, another one might be in charge of education, right? And so by having a strong, organized bureaucracy, which is able to control all different aspects of life, they're able to become a strong, absolute monarchy. Frederick William I is one example of these strong absolute monarchs, and like I said, he appoints these Junkers, these nobles, to important posts. Another ruler, a man named Frederick I, is the one who's involving himself in the War of Austrian Succession against Maria Theresa, who we mentioned before. The third and final one we're going to talk about today is Russia, which helps kind of centralize their power in the 17th century, beginning of the 17th century, with a man named Peter the Great. He was kind of a big fan of what was going on in Western Europe, like the ideas and the culture of Western Europe, and so he desired to kind of emulate that or mimic it. And so that was one way he thought he could centralize power, is by kind of modernizing and adopting Western technology and Western ideas. He also had to kind of rein in the boyars, which are the Russian nobility, and he again kind of incorporates them into the military as well. But Russia and Peter the Great and other absolute monarchs in Russia also create absolutism through religion, right? So it's another method here. We looked a little bit at that with France and Spain, but also in Russia. And in Russia, they use the Orthodox Church. So they're not Roman Catholic, but they're Eastern Orthodox. And they bring the church under the control of the king, and he is able to then appoint bishops, right, or have a say in who appoints the bishops, and has a long influence, a large influence on the people then through the church. This is kind of just a cool image here showing you an Orthodox church in Russia. Classic examples of Russian architecture. The domes there, kind of showing that. Another leader who takes control is a woman named Catherine the Great, who's actually German, but she takes control of Russia after her husband, who was the ruler of Russia, dies, and she helps kind of lead Russia to become a strong military power. One thing that she's involved with is the Partition of Poland, and these three powers all trying to increase their influence and their authority. Right, Frederick II of Prussia, Joseph II of Austria, and Catherine the Great of Russia. They want to expand, but they want to all expand into modern-day Poland. But in order to avoid a war, they actually agreed to divide Poland amongst themselves. So they call it the partition, the division of Poland. But Poland, of course, had no say. They would never agree to this, but they were a weakened power at this point, and they could not avoid this. And so each of them takes control of one part, really flexing the might and the power they have. Plus, when you take over new territory, right, the people, there's no nobles there, right? The nobility doesn't have influence there, so you can exert even more control over that conquered territory, and you can appoint loyal people to be the lords and the other important figures in that region. So expansion through military conquest is a way to increase absolute power. Here's just kind of showing you the different colors here, who acquires what. So the green is what Russia acquires, the yellowish and the orange is what Prussia acquires, and the purple is what Austria acquires during this. So they each get a good chunk. Russia gains most of the land there, though. So we're going to stop there for today. Make sure we complete the lecture activity, and we'll pick up with this in the next lecture.